Well, hello, and welcome back to part two of chapter one. If it seemed like the ending of the first part of chapter one, my discussion was a little abrupt, well, you're exactly right. It was. For some reason, the recording quit about 5 seconds ahead of when I finished talking. So I apologize for that. The last 5 seconds would have been me telling you to stay tuned for part two, and we would do a little review of the main points of chapter one. But before we do the review, I'd like for you to take a look at this question that's on the screen. And certainly our focus throughout the course will be to learn how to think critically about the role that the mass media play in our lives. But look at this question. What mass messages have you encountered recently whose purpose is a combination of information, persuasion, amusement, and enlightenment? Well, maybe something comes to your mind right away. Maybe you'll need to think on it a little bit. So what we're going to do is review some of the high points of chapter one, and then we'll wrap up this, and this will be a shorter lesson today than the first part. But I would like to come back to this question and see if you have any thoughts about it. I've got one, and I'll share them with you at the end of the class. We've been talking about media literacy, and certainly one of the things that I would like for us to be thinking about, these various forms of the mass media. You know, in the previous lesson, we talked about industrial technology, which began with printing and books and newspapers and magazines. Then the chemical technology, film and motion pictures, then electronic technology for radio, then TV, and then the internet. And we also talk about social media on the web. Well, each of these forms, technically, we call them the media platforms. And so part of our media literacy is understanding that each of these platforms has some good things about it and maybe not some bad things, but some limitations, the possibilities of various forms of the mass media. You know, books are one of the oldest forms, and a book is useful to a person only if that person is literate, if that person has the ability to read. Otherwise, well, it's nothing but just a bunch of pages sewn together with some kind of symbols printed on it. You know, if you can't recognize letters and words and sentences, if you don't have the ability to read, a book is pretty foreign to you, isn't it? So that's a limitation. But by the same token, a book has possibility when compared to some other forms of the mass media, because a book is ultimately portable. And that's not necessarily always true of some of the other forms. I want us in the second bullet point, if you'll notice that, to develop a framework for the history and the traditions of the mass media. And we'll be expanding on that discussion as we work our way through chapters 2 and 3. And then this final bullet point, not to confuse the message with the messenger. And I'll be talking about that in lesson 2 when we talk about communication models. So part of what we're doing is a review. Part of it is sort of a forecast or a preview of things to come. Again, as we talk about developing media literacy, that ability to understand the messages of the mass media, the content of the mass media. Here's an interesting question that the author raises on page 5 of your textbook. This is the first bullet point in red here. The inescapable symbiosis of the mass media. Can we do anything without having the media as our companion? You know, we looked at that chart on page 4, all the different ways that we multitask with the mass media, doing other things, but at the same time paying attention to the radio or TV or something online, whatever. So this phrase, inescapable symbiosis, well, for that phrase to make sense, we need to understand those two words and what the concept behind it is. I'm going to presume that you studied symbiosis in a biology class somewhere. That's typically where symbiosis gets talked about, symbiotic relationships. Some living things have symbiotic relationships where one feeds off the other and vice versa. One requires the other in order to continue to live. Well, that's sort of the comparison that your author is making, comparing us with the mass media. Do we need all of this media content in order? Well, we don't need it to live, but it certainly is the quality of life that's talking about. And it's at least his opinion that this symbiotic relationship is inescapable. It's going to happen. We are a part of it. I spent a good bit of time in the first lesson talking about the second bullet point, and that is that, at least in the author's opinion, advertising is the most popular form of a persuasive message in the mass media. The commercials, trying to convince us, persuade us to buy the products and services. And then I spent an equal amount of time, I think, on the third bullet point, and that is that by the very definition of mass communication, it means that we rely on technology in order for that activity, that form of communication to take place must have some kind of technology or machinery involved at some point in the process in getting that message from the person or company that sends it to us and those of us that receive it. We did talk briefly of some criticisms in Lesson 1. Well, maybe not. We did talk about fragmentation of the audience, but I think I framed it in such a way for you that I said this is the fact. I'm not going to express an opinion whether the fragmentation or the dividing up of the audience, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or an indifferent thing. Well, that's up for you to decide. I'll present the information to you, and then I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions. But there are certain people who think that the mass media does not do necessarily a good job anymore at bringing us together. It actually does a better job of subdividing us and giving so much content that everybody goes off in their own direction to find something that's of interest to them. You tie that into the second bullet point there. A lot of criticism over the years that the media are delivering the type of content that is less and less family friendly. There's just not enough TV programs out there, for instance, where the entire family wants to gather around the TV, watch the same program at the same time. That was much more common in the early days of television back in the 1950s and 1960s. And then, at least since the 1950s and 60s, even earlier in the movies, and perhaps even prior to that in books and magazines, that the mass media presents society with too much content that is sexually oriented or has a lot of gratuitous violence in it. So these are some of the criticisms. They're out there for you to think about, but again, you get to make up your own mind about this. This is another chart that appears, I think it's on page 4 in your textbook. And again, just to try and make up sort of what we call a holistic impression with you. We're not going to take this chart apart, but I think it serves us well to look at least a part of it and understand that television, watching TV, much more than any other traditional form or even new form, including the internet, we spend a lot more of our waking hours with television than we do the other platforms of mass media. Again, this is an observation. I'm not passing judgment. That's up for you to decide, but I would like for you to take a look at this chart and give it some thought and reflect on it. On this slide of mediated communication, I did allude to in the first part of this discussion the idea that speech communication amongst humans, talking, if you will, has been around a lot longer than the mass media. Individual, interpersonal communication, one person speaking to another, or we enlarge the scenario, we bring other people into the act, and we talk about group communication. Now, one of the questions that often gets raised about the difference between speech communication and mass communication, and that is, how large does the audience have to grow to outgrow the idea of being a group and grow large enough to be considered to be a mass audience? And there's no specific number that you can assign to that. If we were in the classroom right now, I probably would ask you to look around the room, and there'd be maybe 24, 25 of us in the classroom, and I would ask, is that a group? Do we represent a large enough assembly of human beings to be considered a group, or are we considered a mass? And is my delivery of the lecture to you, is that a form of speech communication, or is it a form of mass communication? And typically what I'd say is that my opinion is it's not mass communication, because the group is, the assembly, the 25 of us or so, is not large enough. And for the most part, I'm not using any technology when I speak to you, maybe outside of directing your attention up to the screen for the PowerPoint display. But other than that, limited use of technology. And then a preview of a discussion that we're going to be having in chapters 2 and 3, and that's this idea of how audience and feedback play into the role of how mass communication works. All of this comes under the general classification of explaining just exactly how does mass communication work, at least how those people who research it and study it, it's their opinion of how it works. And certainly one of the things that we'll factor in there is that many times in the process of mass communication, distance, the distance between those people who are making and sending the message is a fairly significant distance from where the receivers of the message are located. And I have a diagram or a model that I'm going to be presenting to you and asking you to think about that. And this model, by the way, will be one that applies mostly to industrial communication, as we see down at the bottom of the page. Media and society, some questions to ask ourselves. Do the media have a unifying influence on us? Are there times when the media bring us together? Well, we've got an event coming up on TV in a few weeks called the Super Bowl. It certainly will bring a large number of people together, although some may be cheering for one team and some may be cheering for another, and still yet a third group might be there just to watch the commercials. So you can make up your mind as to how unifying the Super Bowl as a media event is for us. But certainly in a more serious tone, the ability of the mass media to bring important news and information to us, is it serving us well as a nation, as a democracy in our republic? Are the mass media having an effect to bring us together, or is the news and information resulting in a division of us as a nation of Americans, or citizens of the world, for that point? Moral consensus, certainly the content of the media comes into question. We'll be talking about that in upcoming chapters. Fragmentation, I put that back into the bullet points just to remind you that there is a lot of discussion out there as to whether or not the media are doing their role in bringing us together or further dividing us. And that leads to that bottom point, the demassification, the division of us. And some people would say that thanks to all of the numbers of radio stations, of TV stations and TV channels on the cable and on the satellite, and now all of the audio and video content that's available on the internet, if you take into consideration all of those possibilities, maybe the idea of broadcasting has gone by the wayside. We've got so many choices, subdividing people in so many ways, maybe it's not broadcasting anymore. Maybe It's narrowcasting. Now, coming back to the first bullet point that you see on this slide, and I ask you to think about the answer to this question. And so I'm going to be silent for just a moment and give you a little more time to think about this, and then I'm going to share my observation with you. Okay, do you have an example yet? Here's my example, and I've already mentioned this event in the first part of the Chapter 1 lessons, and I've mentioned it again in this lesson. It seems to me that the combination of information, persuasion, amusement, and enlightenment, learning more, isn't that true of most of the commercials that we'll be watching during the upcoming Super Bowl? Don't we get information about products? Aren't we persuaded to buy them? Many of them we watch, not so much out of a need to know, but out of a need to be entertained and perhaps amused. And don't we learn? Aren't we enlightened as a result of some of the messages that we see? Now, some of you may be thinking that's a rather frivolous example. I think it's actually a pretty good one. But what I would challenge you to do is to be thinking about other types of communication that might fit the bill, might be a good answer to this question. So please think about that. That second bullet point raises that really important question. Are the mass media good at bringing us together, or are they even better at finding ways to separate us? And there can be multiple examples of this that we can find in news broadcasting, in the news that we watch and hear and read about, in the entertainment programs that we watch and listen to on TV and in the movies. So I think you get the idea about the question and what it's trying to get to. So I want you to be thinking about that. And then how does communicating through the mass media and social media, how does that differ from personal, interpersonal, or group communication? And we've given some examples of that, and I hope that you'll be thinking about answers to those questions as well. So at this point, I think we'll probably draw the strings and pack the box up on Chapter 1. Again, if you haven't read this chapter in its entirety, please do so. The next lesson, we go right into Chapter 2, and I really think, as I said previously, that you'll get the most out of the lecture if you have studied the chapter carefully in advance of listening to my narrated PowerPoints. So again, please read chapters 1 and 2 carefully. Take care, and I'll see you on the next lesson, okay?